introduce and turn this over to Elise Capella.
Welcome back. I hear this is your first week back, so I hope you had a restful and rejuvenating break. And if you need to jump up and down because you're cold in the middle of the talk, I will not be offended. Feel free to do that. And also feel free to interrupt me if there's questions of clarification or if you just want to launch a mini discussion before the end. I will move us ahead if I feel like that makes sense, and that we will stop and have a discussion if that makes sense. So what I'm hoping to do today is first to convince you of the need for a combined mental health and educational approach to supporting kids in classrooms. And this is not alone, of course, but in conjunction with other approaches to promoting children's academic achievement and broader mental health and well-being, as Andrew was just discussing. And then I'm going to describe one approach that we have developed and studied as a means through which to strengthen classroom contexts, using existing resources in schools and communities as a delivery and support system, and focusing both on the whole classroom as a space for academic learning and also mental health outcomes, but also on targeted students. So students with behavioral or academic needs that are identified. I'm going to explain what the short-term effects of this approach were in a trial that we did in the New York City public schools, both on classrooms and on plays. And then I'm going to move and spend a little bit of time talking about how that work really morphed into some peer context in classrooms as another space that we need to think about and target in intervention supports for kids. And then move at the very end to the next steps for research and innovation. And I want to make the case right now that this is not about a particular intervention or a particular program, even though I'm going to be describing one, but it's really about how we support daily practice in schools to benefit kids and their outcomes, particularly in urban and public schools. So the underlying premise of really all of my work is that schools have an inherent potential to promote children's development, broadly speaking. And that is given their space, where they are in school and communities, that they have this juncture between families and neighborhoods. And given that most children spend many days a week, many hours a day in school. And yet, many schools struggle to fulfill this potential and reach their mission of supporting all children's development. And this is particularly true for schools in more underfunded urban districts. And there's multiple and complex barriers across levels of ecological context, as many of you know quite well. These don't even really capture all of those areas. As you see, the macro context is not even included here. And here are just some voices of teachers from one trial that we did in the Chicago public schools, just to kind of illuminate some of these barriers across levels of the context. So this is really about neighborhood violence in the south end of Chicago. So one teacher says once they go home, most of them pretty much are on lockdown. They're not allowed to go outside to play because in this neighborhood it was very likely to get shot in the front yard. And she was not exaggerating. Another teacher, who's a kindergarten teacher, is really talking about family and neighborhood levels of poverty in her community. She says, I'm a stressed out mess because if I only had to focus on the teaching aspect of it, there's enough stress that goes with that. And as much as I try not to think about it and ignore it, I just can't. It's hard to do when the babies are walking in, looking so hard. This teacher talks about school level disorganization. She says, well, I mean, I don't know if you can hear it now, but there's constant noise, constant chaos. There's no order whatsoever. There don't seem to be any school rules here. And this teacher is talking about her classroom and kids with behavioral difficulties in her classroom. She says, over half my class has behavior issues. It just depends on the day and who's in what mood and what happens the night before. And this is the level that I'm going to be focusing on today. But I want you to keep that broader context in mind through all of this. So why focus on classrooms and on children? Classrooms are the primary learning context of kids in schools, particularly if you think about elementary school settings where they're with one teacher for most of the school day. And a number of studies have shown fairly sizable between classroom effects on children's academic outcomes, much more sizable than between school effects. And then recently there have been several studies, many more than I can count, that show that teaching practices and the effectiveness of those teaching practices matter for children's outcomes, broadly speaking. At the child level, they're even larger between child effects and between classroom effects. So we know from decades of research now that how children enter school and how they spend those first few years of school in terms of their early achievement and early adjustment matters for their long-term outcomes, including graduation, on-time graduation, and beyond. And then in schools that serve predominantly students whose families are below the poverty line, those children have less access to effective teaching practices, and they have more extensive and more intensive early adjustment programs. And yet, what's really interesting is work by some friends of mine at the University of Virginia that has found that when children start school with multiple problems, so start kindergarten with behavioral and academic problems, and yet have access to high quality teaching practices or effective classrooms. And in this case, this is measured via an observational measure of emotional support in first grade, that those kids achieve at the same level as their counterparts who have no problems, no adjustment problems as they're entering school. So what this says to me, and other studies have shown this as well, is that students with adjustment problems, behavioral and academic, benefit from effective teaching practices or effective classrooms. I don't think I'm preaching to the choir here. I know that many of you study this day in and day out. So based on some of this work, a number of research teams have developed and tested in demonstration trials teacher consultation and coaching programs. And these have shown that they can improve teaching practices in high poverty preschool and elementary school settings. Most of these models that are out there and have been tested in these demonstration trials, however, focus either on the one hand on the classroom as a whole context for learning, or on the other hand, individual kids who are really struggling. Also, most of these programs or models rely on external sources of funding or external human resources to come into the school or to coach teachers outside of the school. And so what we were trying to do in this work that I'm presenting today is to incorporate existing school resources, so internal school and community staff, in intervention delivery to improve its sustainability, and to focus on both enhancing the classroom as a whole and individual child outcomes. So who are these internal resources? So nowadays, most schools across the nation, really, although this varies tremendously across districts and even across schools, have one or more staff member who has been trained in mental health treatment and assessment, who is working in their school at least part-time, if not full-time. And they tend to be fairly knowledgeable about assessment and treatment. They tend to have much less training in or experience working closely with teachers in classrooms. And so what we thought we would try to do is train and support these existing mental health staff, and they could be counselors, social workers, school psychologists, or other folks in the school, to help teachers build more effective classrooms for all students, including those with behavioral difficulties, and to thereby improve child behaviors, relationships in the classroom, and their experience. So we didn't do this from a vacuum. We did this based on a huge amount of existing research and also theory, and then two specific models that were already out there. One that's called Links to Learning, and one that's called My Teaching Partner. I'm going to spend very little time on these, but I'm happy to talk about them more at the end. So Links to Learning is an urban mental health model, and it has shown in a fairly sizable trial in Chicago public schools to have effects on kids with disruptive behavior problems in elementary schools in terms of their social skills, in terms of their teacher reporting, academic competence, and in terms of their observed academic engagement. And My Teaching partner is a teacher professional development model that has been studied in now several trials, starting in preschool and moving into middle school and secondary education, high school settings, has been shown to have positive effects on students' achievement test scores and on student-teacher interactions. And yet, on the one hand, the Links to Learning mental health model has a fairly low-intensity classroom intervention component, and therefore did not find any effects on the classroom as a whole context in terms of teacher-student interaction and effective practices. And my teaching partner, on the other hand, focuses on the classroom context, but not on the individual students in that classroom, who the teachers talk about most of the time that they have to talk about their students, as the ones that really get in the way of them using effective practices. And this model relies on external funding and external teachers. So we decided to use these as a base and build from them and integrate them into something that we had to call something, so we called it Bridge. And it's a teacher consultation and coaching model that's embedded within the regular daily activities of school-based mental health professionals and designed to increase effective classroom interactions and also the functioning of closely without behavior problems. And it's like MTP, my teaching partner, it's based in a particular framework of measuring and understanding quality classroom interactions. And this is one that has been developed over years of time as a measurement tool. It's very strongly theoretically based. It's been validated in thousands and thousands of classrooms across the country. And this framework called the class has 3 domains of focus. And for this particular project, we focused on 2 of those 3 domains. We focused on emotional support and on classroom organization. So emotional support is how teachers help students to develop warm and supportive relationships with each other and with the teacher, to enjoy and get excited about learning, to feel comfortable and safe in the classroom, and to have appropriate levels of autonomy depending on their age. And organization is how teachers help students to develop skills to regulate their behaviors in the classroom, to get the most from the learning opportunities that there are, and to maintain engagement and interest. And these 2 domains, and the 3rd domain as well, have specific dimensions of practice. And within those dimensions, specific indicators that say that teachers is being involved in promoting this. It's at this dimension level, positive climate, all-grade instructional learning formats, that Bridge is really operating at. I'll get back to that in a second. So one key component of Bridge is this continuous improvement cycle that happens between the consultant or the school-based mental health professional and the teacher on a regular basis. The cycle starts with assessment. It starts with a school-based mental health professional coming into a classroom and observing the teaching practices using the class lens, and observing 1 or 2 target students in the classroom with identified behavioral difficulties that the teacher has been struggling with. After that observation, the mental health professional and the teacher meet. And they meet to reflect on what happened in that observation at the classroom level and at the target student level. So to identify some needs and some strengths in that observation, and then to identify 1 or 2 evidence-informed strategies that the teacher could implement to try to shift what's going on. And then the 3rd step in that continuous improvement cycle is the action step, or the implementation of that 1 or 2 evidence-informed strategy designed to improve the interactions in the classroom and with that targeted student. And this cycle is meant to continue about monthly over the course of the intervention. Okay, so what are these evidence-informed strategies? As you see on the left side, those are all the dimensions from the classroom assessment scoring system that you saw earlier. The top 3 are in emotional support, and the bottom 3 are in classroom organization. And then we did a huge review of both education and psychology literatures. We also derived some of these from the existing Links to Learning and my teaching partner programs to come up with evidence-informed, class-wide, and targeted student strategies that the teacher could implement almost as a kernel or a daily behavioral practice without too much extra training and support. So for example, the good behavior behavior, have you heard of this before? It's something that started back in 1979 and has been used in trials all over the world now, actually. It's a group contingency reward system that's pretty commonly known in psychology circles that teachers can implement at any time during the school day. They can implement it during transition, they can implement it during a 20-minute math lesson, they can implement it across the entire morning. And it helps the kids to know what are the rules, what are the positive reinforcement for the rules, and what are the consequences of breaking those rules. It's fairly simple, fairly straightforward, happy to model it for you. Self-monitoring is something that can be done with individual target students. And it's a way of helping students to be aware of their behaviors and begin to manage them themselves. We use notes or daily report cards or from school night notes, if you've heard of those, are ways of engaging families in supporting what's happening in the classroom. Think, pair, share, advanced organizers, others have come from the education literature that are less familiar to mental health providers, but much more familiar to teachers. And all of these are linked very concretely to what we would observe as effective practice, linked to those dimensions. That is the framework approach as a whole. Okay, so putting it all together, the school-based mental health professionals are chosen differently across each school. So we did something called a resource mapping procedure, where we tried to understand what are the resources that already exist in the school. Who are the mental health staff who are here, who might be able to get trained in this model and support teachers. Those mental health staff vary across the schools, and they received 2 days of training. The teachers received a very short training, about half of a day, in the classroom assessment scoring system as a whole, and also in effective teaching as a practice. And then the launch before this continuous improvement cycle started was a teacher interview. So this mental health staff knew the teacher already, but we really wanted them to engage in a motivational interview kind of half an hour to try to understand what the teacher's perspective on her classroom was, what she thought that the strengths and needs were for the kids, and what she really wanted to work on. And so that was the intervention model. In terms of our research or our logic model, we were expecting that implementation of this would change teaching practice in these 2 domains and would shift classroom relationships between teachers and students and potentially between peers, and thereby lead to positive adjustment outcomes for students. Okay. So we engaged in 2 phases of research. The first was to integrate links to learning and my teaching partner into this new model for its implementation context. So we did this through a community-university partnership over the course of a couple of years, although 1 year was the primary data collection year. We mostly collected qualitative data from this, the refinement of these models into this one model approach. And then in the second phase, we engaged more schools, and we used a classroom randomized design to test the initial implementation and effects across 1 year of this model. So we partnered with one community agency in New York City, and this community agency is one that has a school-based mental health program as a part of it. And they have school-based mental health staff, again, anywhere from social workers to school psychologists who spend part-time or full-time in an existing neighborhood school. In phase 1, we had 2 school partners. In phase 2, we had 5 school partners. And as you see from this, the schools were mostly serving students who were eligible for free lunch and mostly serving Latino students. That was not something that we were targeting in advance, but that was the set of schools that we were working with for this trial, which was pretty different than the links to learning schools, which were mostly African-American students, and then my teaching partner schools, which have ranged mostly Caucasian students in their initial trials to much more ethnically and racially diverse student bodies in their later trials. This is something that might come up in later discussion. So the other thing I want to mention on this participant flowchart is that we ended up having 36 classrooms across 5 schools that were randomized to either receive the full bridge model, which includes that continuous improvement cycle that you saw, or just the initial training. So everyone got an initial training, all of the teachers, all of the school-based mental health staff, and only some then got the consultation and coaching. We used a variety of measurement methods and reporters. So we had observations of teaching practice using the classroom assessment scoring system. We had teacher reports of teacher-student relationships, peer reports of victimization and aggression, teacher reports of behavioral regulation, child reports of their academic competence or self-concept, and a number of both qualitative and quantitative measures of implementation, dosage, and fidelity. So this is just to say that the intervention ended up being about 4 months. You might ask why, it's supposed to be pre-post across one school year, right? But by the time we actually got all of the student consents back from students and from parents, and we did all of the trainings and we randomized, it was already December. So the intervention really went from January until April, when we then had to collect the post data. Implementation was adequate for 4 months. We expected that the cycle would go through about once a month, and that's exactly what we found. We did intent to treat analysis, capitalizing on the classroom randomized design. We didn't have any significant between school effects, so we didn't have enough schools to really nest it at the school level anyways, but we didn't need to in terms of the lack of differences between schools. In all of our models, we had a whole series of covariates. We eventually dropped some of them because they weren't adding anything to the model. And for reasons of course, we dropped them. I'm happy to give you that credit. I think it's also in the paper. But we always had the pre-level of whatever the outcome was in the models. And we always had class size, classroom type, teaching experience, and some other things at the child level in these models. These were random effects regression models at the child level and just regressions at the classroom level. And we did, even though we had fairly limited power to look at moderation, given the goal of focusing also on target students with behavioral difficulties, we did look to see whether there was any magnified effect for kids with behavioral difficulties at the child level. And here's what we found. We found effects in the right direction for assignment to bridge on teacher-student relationship closeness, reported by teachers, on peer victimization, reported by children about each other, and on academic self-concept. We did not find any effects on teacher-student relationship conflict, on aggressive behavior, or on behavioral regulation. And all of the significant effects at the child level were magnified for children with behavioral difficulties, although they weren't always significant because of their limited power, but they were all stronger effects for kids with behavioral difficulties. There were no main effects at the classroom level, looking at observed teacher-student interactions with the class. However, a moderated effect. So for teachers whose classrooms had low levels of emotional support in the fall of the intervention year, if they were assigned to bridge, they improved the emotional support by the spring of the intervention year, as compared with the teachers who were not assigned to bridge. The same was not true for classroom organization. Okay. So what we took from these findings was that classroom support to teachers in urban schools that's focused simultaneously on how you build effective classroom interactions across all kids and on working productively and positively with kids with behavioral difficulties can be embedded into the regular daily practice of one or more school-based mental health professional who's already there, and can enhance classroom emotional support for teachers with low levels in the beginning, and some psychosocial outcomes for kids, but not all. There are many questions that remain, and that I imagine are swimming through your head at the moment. One is whether this is sustainable in the long run. Another is whether the effects continue beyond that first year, whether you need to do this multiple years for those effects to continue. And the extent to which there would be effects on other outcomes that we didn't test here. We didn't test any academic skills outcomes. We didn't expect that a short intervention was going to be able to do that. But that's important to test in the future. And then lastly, although this may not be something that you end up going to, but I often think about in classroom peer contexts. It's another area of research that I'm very interested in. And we had these effects on peer victimization, where kids were less likely to be victimized, experience victimization, nominate other kids as victims in classrooms that had this intervention than in classrooms that didn't. And it made me think about the context of those peer interactions in the classroom and how we didn't target them directly, and yet we might need to, especially as we're thinking about moving beyond elementary school into middle school settings, which we are. So this is what I'm going to turn to for the next little bit. So developmental scientists, developmental psychologists, people who study kids in schools from a psychology perspective, tend to think that this is what classrooms are. Classrooms are what the teacher brings to the classroom, their levels of skill, experience, support, stress, other things. What the child brings to the classroom, from their home, from their neighborhood, from their own temperament, and their own background. And that these two things are really what makes up how a child's going to do in that classroom. And yet, some have argued, and I would be in this group, that the peer context, that all of the other kids, the composition of that classroom, is potentially equally important as both what the teacher is bringing and what the child is bringing. And we know from now, again, decades of research, that individual relationships with peers matter. So a child who has a friend, a child who is accepted by their peers, and a child who is linked into the social network in some way generally does okay. And yet these are thinking about kids as individuals. And several theories and people in other disciplines like sociology and economics and physics actually think about class networks broadly. They think about relationships across settings or contexts or spaces. So social network theory, social norms theory, and even social capital theories really argue that it's not just the individual in their relationships that matter, it's the social structures of a space that make a difference, that these social structures or patterns of relationships facilitate or constrain behavior within an existing setting. And that we get our information and we get support and resources via our connections in the social network. And so this is the focus of some secondary analysis that we did using the same data that we collected for this trial. We wanted to ask 3 questions. We wanted to see whether some of these theories apply to classrooms in the ways that we imagined that they would, but had not been tested in this way. So we asked, does the classroom social structure predict students' academic engagement over one academic year, controlling for other things that we think and we know would predict their academic engagement? Does this association vary by the quality of the teaching practices in that classroom? And does this association vary by the child's behavioral difficulties? So let me dig deeper into this idea of classroom social structure. Based on existing theory, we thought that the classroom social structure that would be most beneficial to kids' academic engagement and other kinds of outcomes would be one where kids had connections to each other, had each other as resources, and that those connections were equitably distributed across the classroom. So this is not a classroom where a couple kids are really, really popular, and everyone wants to be friends with them, and everyone is friends with them. But a lot of kids are fairly isolated and peripheral. It's not this kind of classroom. And this is not a classroom where nobody's really very connected, that they're really doing the work by themselves and they don't really have social ties or friendships in the classroom. This is a classroom that has both dense social ties and ties that are distributed fairly equally across everybody. And that equity piece was very important given our focus on kids with behavioral difficulties, who we know from prior work tend to have struggles within social relationships as well. So we use the same data. We dropped out the youngest kids in our sample, the kindergarten and first grade, for whom social network data is very, very difficult to collect reliably. We used the observed teaching practice measure. We also collected some observed engagement of individual kids in the classroom, how often they were attentive, paying attention, doing the work that was asked actively and also passively. We used peer reports, teacher reports, self-reports, and we looked at these questions using multi-level models children nested within classrooms, controlling importantly for intervention. But this was not about the intervention, this was about some psychological analyses, as well as how the classroom goes. Let me just show you a picture of a couple of classrooms. So this is the social network in two different classrooms. And these individual rectangles are kids. The filled in rectangles are boys, and the unfilled rectangles are girls. The lines between them say that there's a connection between those kids. And we used aggregate data across all kids' reports of not only their own friendships, but of everybody else's friendships in the classroom to create these networks. And then we used a binomial calculator to try to figure out whether this connection was beyond what we'd expect from chance, whether they have enough nominations from kids. Yeah. These are second to 10. So 7 to 10.
And you're all in one classroom?
Two different classrooms. So that's classroom A and this is classroom B. Okay. So classroom A has a fairly high density of relationships and quite high equity of relationships in the classroom. Classroom B has a fairly low density and quite low equity of relationships in the classroom. And what you'll see sometimes people look at this and say, well, these kids seem really, really closely tied. So the girls are quite dense in their connections, but the boys are not. And there's about 7 boys who are identified as having no connections. Can I ask a question? Sure.
I noticed they're identified binary in terms of gender. This is self-identification.
Self-identification.
Or like a school reference, like a self-identification.
Interestingly, in these two classrooms, and these were just selected for illustrative purposes, on the left side, the teaching practices in that classroom were fairly high on a scale from 1 to 7. Emotional support was a standard deviation above the mean for that classroom, as was classroom organization. And on the right side, emotional support and classroom organization were a standard deviation below the mean. So this led us to kind of think about these analyses and conduct these analyses. And we found, using these multi-level models, main effects of social network equity on kids' behavioral engagement across 1 year. So on the amount of time they were observed to be engaged in classroom activities, that was positively related to the level of equity in their social networks. And here's that analysis. The coefficient that I was just talking about is right there. And you'll see that we have a bunch of other child level variables in the model, but 2 that I circled are ones that I just wanted to point out. So kids with behavioral difficulties had much lower levels of engagement, and kids with academic motivation, self-reported academic motivation, at higher levels of engagement, as you might expect. But network equity was significant above and beyond those child and also classroom level variables. We then found a moderated effect of social network equity and engagement by teaching practices of classroom organization only. And what this means is that if kids are in classrooms with both high levels of social network equity, which means there's lots of connections, dense connections that are equitably distributed, and those classrooms have teachers who in the fall have high levels of organization, productivity, and engaging teaching practices, really good, positive behavior management techniques, those kids were engaged more than 85% of the time in the survey after control for all levels of engagement. Whereas kids with lower levels of social network equity, those classrooms or lower levels of classroom organization were engaged much less. And then we found a moderating effect of social network equity on engagement by level of student behavioral difficulties as well. And so what this says is that if a child who has high levels of behavioral difficulties is in a classroom that has equitable social relationships, that they are engaged as much as their peers who have low levels of behavioral difficulties in those classrooms. Here are those two coefficients. So in sum, this helps us to think more about classroom social structures. These are correlational, these are not causal. And so one need to be careful in interpreting these too strongly. But it seems that something about the social relationships in these classrooms contributes to students' academic behaviors, how much they are able to attend to what's happening in the classroom on a daily basis. And that the quality of the teaching practice in the classroom organization magnifies these positive effects and is particularly strong for kids with behavioral difficulties that they benefit from. And it makes me think more about the ways in which we might incorporate supports for the peer relationships in the classroom, and not simply the teacher-student relationships. So, we're aware of time, and we'll talk about a couple of things that we're thinking about doing and actively doing right now as next steps. So one is, we're thinking hard about how we coach and support teachers to use more cooperative and peer-assisted learning strategies in the classroom. And this builds from two pieces of information from this trial. One is the interest in focusing more on peer relationships, and that we know that cooperative learning kinds of strategies, peer-assisted learning strategies, tend to help students build social skills as well as academic skills. So we think that would help build peer relationships as well. But also, these strategies were part of our manual, our bridge manual, as things that teachers could choose to implement with the support of a mental health professional, but almost no one did. So we think they're harder to implement, and we think it's important to begin to study how to support teachers to implement them. We focused in this project only on the universal and targeted levels. So all kids at tier 1, kids with behavioral difficulties at tier 2, and we've been asked by a number of school districts to think harder about kids who are at that top tier, who may be in self-contained classrooms with kids with more behavioral difficulties. And so I've been working with my colleague Erin Dean, who is an expert at CBITS and thinking about trauma-informed teaching to begin to do this a little bit better. This is the links to learning model that I didn't show you earlier. There's a whole family component to this model, home-based component, that we did not do in this bridge, that we think is very important to begin to build into this. What bridge did was focus on the classroom much more intensively than individual kids with disruptive behavioral problems in the classroom. We want to add this piece that's focused on families around targets that are predictors of learning. So around how to support parents and other family members in communicating about school with their children, providing support for homework, and providing support for reading and development. And finally, it was very important for us to begin to think about ways of making this work, where the cycle that's only happening monthly, which doesn't feel very intense, could be supplemented by teachers' own monitoring of their evidence-based practice use. So we developed an electronic dashboard to do this. And we wanted to do this in a way that was very feasible. So we used Excel as a platform. And we did a pilot study in the Jersey City schools with a set of classrooms to see whether when teachers then began to implement these evidence-based practices, they then could track some of their students' outcomes, the things that they were focused on, and whether that enhanced their ability to continue to use these practices or to think about new practices to use. And so we're beginning to then embed this whole approach into a district-wide learning collaborative in the Jersey City schools that looks something like this, where the bridge intervention will be part of a broader way in which schools are supporting each other and themselves to use the evidence-based intervention strategies that fit their needs. We think that this approach might help increase the implementation outcomes and the student and child and classroom outcomes for these schools. So I want to just close with a couple last words. This, you might imagine, was not a simple or easy intervention to either develop or to implement or to study. This process is not one that takes place overnight. And yet, we think, and these findings seem to suggest, that there can be small to moderate positive impacts of something like this for both children and for classrooms. And even though these are small to moderate impacts, those can shift trajectories over time, and that is the hope. We need, however, to begin to integrate. So I spoke in the beginning about these multiple levels of approaches to supporting kids' learning and development in urban school and community contexts. This was focused on children in the classrooms. We need to think more strategically about integrating models and supports across these different levels, which means integrating across multiple disciplines and policy this communities. We need these approaches to be infused in daily practices rather than named as an intervention, as we were sort of required to do for this, and yet we didn't really want to do, because we, in the end, want bridge or some pieces of bridge to simply be ways that we can support schools in incorporating good practice into their daily activities and their system and the fabric of the school environment. And then we need to be thinking about how to best study this through community responsive studies and through methodologically rigorous studies, with the end goal, which is always my goal, to helping more kids across the spectrum of strengthening to succeed in schools and beyond. So as I said, it was not simple or easy, and so there's a number of funders that funded the research side, although the funding didn't go to the intervention side at all for purposes of testing sustainability. And a number of collaborators across universities, obviously the schools and families and students are also incredibly important to this effort, and we're really proud of this. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Elise. Questions?
So I think so the class tool, as it looks at positive communication for students, it's a lot of things, just like are we all happy to teach each other and things that we hope every teacher does. But one of the things that we encounter here a lot is, as our student teachers who have a very idealized view of schools go into work with their cooperating teachers, the teachers have negative views, and the teachers have negative views teaching. And I'm wondering if this intervention in any way shapes or changed teachers' beliefs, or if you have any sense of teacher networks that take their adoption.
It's a great question. We did not test teacher beliefs. We do have a bunch of qualitative data that we just published that is focus group data from the end of the intervention, where we asked teachers about their students, about their classrooms, and about the intervention specifically. And so we did, in a qualitative way, see responses from many teachers that they felt supported for the first time, that they felt like the interventions were making small progress, small steps, not big. And not that they necessarily, they didn't in these focus groups report that they used to think negatively and now they think positively. That did not come out. But part of the theory underlying this approach is it's kind of behavioral. It's the notion that we're not trying to change teachers' attitudes or beliefs. We're trying to change specific teacher behaviors and support good teacher, the things that are really productive and positive that teachers are already doing, and enhance the things that they're not doing, so that they see some outcomes in that place. Right? And so they see the positive small steps forward, and then that in turn would change their attitudes. It would be great to actually start that. In terms of teaching networks, the support that they reported was via their mental health professional. There are other models. So Links to Learning used a model where we collected teacher network data actually from each of the schools, and we identified via network analysis the teachers who were the key opinion leaders in the school, the teachers who reached the most other teachers, and we asked 2 of those teachers in each school if they would participate in a web-based course with the mental health professionals on some of the things that I was talking about, and that they would then lead some teacher professional development in the schools. And it was very, very interesting. Those we've done one study to look at the teacher networks after that. It seemed not that the teacher networks necessarily got denser or more equitable. That would be really interesting if they had, but more that teachers who were connected in the network were more likely than to use the evidence-based strategies that were endorsed during the professional communities that these key opinion leader teachers led. So that we know the teacher network is important, and it's a great thing to incorporate in the future to see if we can shift those.
So I'm wondering about the dose and sort of the fidelity, right? Because this is requiring quite a bit both from the coach and the teacher. And I'm wondering if you have some data that shows, relative to dose, because the data you showed was like the 4 months of speed post for 4 months. So I'm wondering if you have some notion of fidelity and how that impacts change, like you have a sense of what might be a more ideal dosage.
So we just wrote this up, actually. So I plan to do in the audience to ask. So it's interesting because we initially thought about it that way. We thought about it as what is the ideal dose? More is better, right? What we ended up finding through mixed method analysis, actually, of our data, was that it really depended on the level of need of the teacher. So we looked at the teacher's class data. We looked at their kind of how many target students they had, what the level of difficulties of those target students were. And we found that teachers who had lower levels of emotional support and classroom organization were pulling for more support. They didn't always get more support because of constraints at a given school with a given, but they were asking for more support, they were pulling for more support, and they often did, although not systematically, right? And that teachers who had higher levels of classroom organization and emotional support were pulling for less support generally and getting a little bit less from it. So there's a little bit of difference there. The other thing is, this is a fairly flexible and responsive model. Right? It's supposed to be based on what are we identifying as, within this dimension of practice, regard for student perspectives, for example, what's going well, what's not going well, and what do we implement to help these things go better, right? And so it ended up being quite different by teacher. Some teachers focus the entire time on 2 dimensions. They tend to be behavior management and positive climate. Some teachers really cycle through 4 dimensions in the 4 months. Some teachers focus much more, and some consultants focus much more on class-wide strategies. They really just wanted the good behavior games to be implemented really well. and maybe one other class-wide strategy, because that was where the action was. And some consultants thought, oh yeah, this classroom's going pretty well as a whole. It's these particular kids that need a lot of support. So we do a lot of self-management, a lot of daily report cards, et cetera, with those kids. So my answer is very complex and nuanced. It wasn't simply about more is better. It's about what is better for a given teacher in a given classroom at a given time. And there were unfortunately some barriers to always doing that.
Do you think the implementation in the middle of the year had
Yes.
So you guys, are you going to try that again? Are you going to try that again where you can start in the summer?
Yes. Yeah, we'll try it again starting this summer. You know, it's interesting. I always, when I talk to teachers, really think, I talk about how to really start over in the middle of the year, because you can. And there's strategies and tricks for doing it, especially when the kids are a little younger, right? And so we talk about those strategies and tricks, and I talk to the consultants about that. But I wasn't working with the teachers, I was working with consultants. The extent to which they did that in their consultation, we weren't sitting in on every consultation, obviously, so not sure how much they were able to help teachers sort of rethink things and present the new thing they're doing in a way that kids would be excited about, be engaged in, be willing to kind of try out as if it were reading media. But absolutely, we're going to try it.
Ian, is there anything in the data that suggested why you couldn't find affecting classroom management?
Nothing in our data that helped us with that. Anecdotally, and also from some other intervention studies that are out there, it seems that it's a little bit easier to shift emotional support than classroom organization. So we didn't separate behavior management out from productivity and instructional learning formats. In terms of implementation, instructional learning formats was rarely focused on. Behavior management was often focused on, productivity was somewhere in the middle. We were worried about pulling out the dimension by dimension to look at our analysis, because those dimensions they're reasonably reliable, but we were only in the classroom for 2 hours to observe, and we felt like it was important to keep the domains together. So it might have been that there were some shifts in behavioral management, but not in productivity and instructional learning formats. I'm not sure the answer to that question. Yeah.
Okay, so then we'll take a 5-minute break and then reconvene here. Extended discussion, but thank you, Elise.